Hey guys, Wyatt Claypool here, and I am back with another Ontario provincial election update. I first want to start off talking about the movement in the polls, and then I want to talk about the motivations of Doug Ford for calling this provincial election, because I suspect much of it actually has to do with his ire for the federal Conservatives more than his actual desire to win another term early. That is also playing into it, but there has always been a long time frenemies type relationship between the Ontario Progressive Conservatives and the Federal Conservative Party of Canada. Anyways, first, let's start out with the polling. But guys, remember, like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment on what you've been thinking about the Ontario provincial election. Has this been an entire practice in futility, or does this election actually matter? Since we last talked, this is what the polling had looked like. Actually, I'm going to start off with day 1, 2, and 3, then we'll go 7, 8, 9, and then days 13 and 14. So on day 1 of the tracking poll that Main Street Research had been putting out, the PC party was around 32%, the Ontario Liberals 24, and the Ontario NDP 19. You'll notice that there was a lot of undecideds early along. On day 1, there's 16%. On day 2, there's 17. Day 3, there is 19, but we see a consistent rise for the PCs, the Liberals struggling in the low 20s, and the NDP contracting quite heavily from 19% down to 16. And then we had the hot mic moment for Doug Ford, where he said that he 100% wanted Donald Trump to win the presidential election, but then Donald Trump betrayed them by threatening the trade war and all this stuff, which is a lie on multiple fronts. He literally endorsed Tim Walz as the Democratic vice presidential candidate. He obviously is more of a Democrat than he is a Republican if he was a governor in the United States. But Doug Ford wants to signal that he's actually quite right wing, don't you know, even though all of his policy achievements, quote unquote, have to do with him partnering with the federal Trudeau Liberals to subsidize favored industries. He has crazy high taxes. He's undermined parental rights. He's passed new DEI programs. It's awful. By the way, guys, please vote if you're in the Ontario, the province of Ontario. Please vote for the New Blue Party of Ontario. In fact, I will link their website down below on all the ridings that they still need candidates in. It's just about a dozen or so. If you live in that riding and you think you can be a candidate there, guys, sign up. There's like a little bit more than a day left to get your paperwork in to be a candidate. You basically just print it off, get 25 signatures, and you're the New Blue candidate. Just get in contact with them. I'll have their email below. I think it's like info@newblueontario.ca. It'll be there. Check it out. Make sure you vote for them. But then after this hot mic moment, we see this is when Doug Ford was riding high. This poll was technically taking the day after the hot mic moment, but the news cycle in Canada tends to be pretty slow, and it usually takes a day or two for people to kind of catch up with what had occurred. And so on day 7, we have the Ontario PCs at 38%, the Liberals at 25%, and the NDP floundering all the way down at 14%. A lot of people were consolidating early on with Doug Ford under the excuse that the trade war justified Ford needing a big new mandate, and he's the Protect Ontario guy, so we need him on our side. I'm going to get to later how he's pivoting on the Protect Ontario platform and starting to name other countries that he has to protect Ontario from, since the US Canada sort of angle doesn't work as well now. But on day 7, he's at 38%. And on day 8, he crashes down to 32%, and the undecided spike from 14% to 22%. And then the Liberals basically still contract a little bit more as well, and the NDP jumps a bit. Again, that's to be expected. Day-to-day polling is not going to look the same. You're not going to have radical shifts for no reason. If a big shift happens, it's probably for a news-related reason. But, 1 or 2 points up and down, that's pretty standard. Day 9, we have the Ontario PCs further fall from 32 to 30. We have the Liberals gain a point. We have the NDP actually gain several points, going from 15 to 19, but those undecideds remain high. Now let's jump closer to today. We'll do day 13, which was the yesterday's or 2 days ago's tracking poll, and day 14, which was yesterday. So on day 13, we see that the PCs have recovered from this bad day 9 polling. They are now at 35% But the Liberals have stabilized themselves as the sort of number two party in Ontario, that they're in a horse race with the Ford PCs. So on day 13, it's 35% PC, 28 Liberal, 16 NDP, and we see those undecideds continuing to shrink. Obviously, we also have the Greens at 5 and other at 4. Other would probably be bigger if you actually included the New Blue Party of Ontario. Whenever Leger does, and they don't pull the province all that often, usually New Blue is at 2 or 3%, and that is with not much coverage of them, which is pretty decent. But let's go to day 14 now. Day 14, we have the PCs rising again from 35 to 37 here. The Ontario Liberals gaining another point, and the NDP contracting. The NDP's just been having a heck of a time trying to gain any traction. But probably in the coming days, I'm going to go away from the undecided polls, because getting later in the campaign, if you're not decided at all or you're not leaning, I'll probably include the leaning poll, which removes people from the undecided category if they admit that, yeah, but I'm leaning towards this party. Because late in the campaign, if you're undecided, it probably means you're not voting. So what we have here is 37 to 29, with the Liberals, as you can see, just 8 points behind the Conservatives. When you do the leaning, the PC party is more ahead than the pure undecided poll. But the problem for Doug Ford is that I would argue he is one bad debate performance away from this being a real race. In fact, before I get to the video I want to talk about on X, on Doug Ford's social media account, I want to jump to the dashboard of the Ontario election that Main Street has. They do really great resources. I know some people criticize Main Street because they've been slightly off in the popular vote in the past. In BC, yes, they were like a couple points off the popular vote, but they actually had the seat count more correct than others. Every pollster was having a problem with that election because it was hard to see where the new Conservative Party vote was going to come from, because they only got 2% in the last election. They had nothing to go on. So it would have been difficult to suspect that independent candidates were going to have as big of an effect on the ability for BC Conservatives to win seats, as well as the big spike in support in Surrey that was hard to pick up on because South Asian Canadians tend to be very unlikely to take polls. But here is the current seat projections, and we do see that the Ontario PCs have a 93% chance of winning a majority government, 84 seats, which is in fact one seat better than they did in 2022. But the thing I would caution PC supporters here on is that when you actually look at what is making up their current seat count, you have a lot of PC leaning seats, some toss ups, which basically means it's a 50-50. There's a lot of PC leaning seats here, about 15 of them that they're relying on for this big majority. And then there are likely PC seats, which means that it's probably a good 60 to 70% chance that they win those seats. The problem for Ford is if in a debate he fumbles, that's when you can have an entire political career really come into question. If a scandal breaks, if there is some sort of corruption scandal, something gets uncovered, that's what can take a lead like this down to nothing. Same thing happened in Saskatchewan. If the Saskatchewan party had a big scandal in the last week, good chance the NDP party ends up winning that provincial election. And like BC was a true toss-up. But there's a lot of elections where, unless you're at 100% likelihood of winning, if anything happens, your 94% chance of getting a majority and your 5% of a minority could flip, and it could end up being a chance of a 30% or 40% chance of just winning a minority for somebody like Doug Ford. I know other polls are showing the Ford government at like 47%. I just frankly don't believe those. The mood in Ontario is not extremely pro Ford. People tolerate Ford. In fact, a lot of federal conservatives do not like him. When I go over the charts of who's voting PC, the PC voter base, other than they have a strong appeal with men, they have a very liberal-esque type voting coalition. Because the Liberal Party of Canada, although you wouldn't expect it because it's a left-wing party or a lefty party, it's gone full left-wing, I would say, in the last few years. But because the Liberals are a left-wing party, the stereotype, it's a lot of college students voting for them, young millennial women type people like that. That's in fact the NDP's voting coalition. The Liberal voting coalition, both federally and provincially, has always been older pensioners. Obviously, that doesn't apply to you guys because you're all conservatives, but that is the disproportionate voter base. Obviously, I disproportionately should be likely to vote NDP, but I'm a conservative because things have shifted quite a bit. But Ford's government basically wins on pensioner votes. They do not have good support with middle aged people. Yes, they win men, which means that he is actually, in fact, stealing a lot of the Ontario Liberal support because then the Liberals are winning older women, which means Bonnie Crombie doesn't really have much room to grow. Federal conservatives don't vote in provincial elections. That's why, whenever we see an Ontario provincial poll, whenever Kudo Maggie includes a federal question, it actually shows the federal Liberals winning by like 3 or 4 points over the federal conservatives. I'm just going to say right up front, I don't believe that. I do not believe the federal Liberals are actually leading the Conservatives in Ontario. I even have good evidence that they're not leading the federal Conservatives in Ontario using Main Street's own polling data. Because Main Street, when they've done a purely federal only poll, it's just a national poll, and they have the same sample size in Ontario that they do provincially. They poll 950 people provincially and federally. When it's a federal only poll, the Conservatives are leading by like 6 or 7 or 8 points. When you do a provincial poll, suddenly the Liberals are leading by 4 or 5 points. And I suspect it's because a federal Conservative picks up the phone, they hear it's a provincial election poll. Oh my goodness, I couldn't care less. And they hang up because Ford is a Liberal effectively. He goes on every single subsidy program with the Liberals. He literally celebrated, his Minister of Economic Development celebrated the cricket factory, the factory that produced crickets for human consumption. They celebrated that. They have passed DEI programs. They have gotten rid of any sort of parental rights legislation that they were promising back in 2018. They're complete hacks. They, in fact, voted for an NDP bill to put critical race theory teaching in schools. These people are nuts. Again, please vote for the New Blue Party. Run for the New Blue Party if you're in one of these ridings that still needs a candidate. Places like Willowdale, they need a candidate. Some of the Toronto ridings probably won't end up with candidates. It's just hard to get people to run for a really conservative party in like Toronto. It's just a hard area to get signatures as well because everyone lives in like towers. But my goodness, like also the New Blue Party, it's not like the PPC where it's like trying to be hyper pure and you're not good enough for us, so we're starting our own party. The New Blue Party basically agrees 90% with the federal conservatives. It is a very mainstream federal conservative-esque provincial party. And this is where I'm going to get to what is Doug Ford's motivation to call this election? Because he's flip-flopping around trying to find a reason why he even called it. Here's a video he recently put up, now trying to pivot on his Protect Ontario slogan to say, actually, we need to protect Ontario from China. And I actually kind of agree that, yeah, Canada needs to protect its trade from China because China is a hostile force and we should be trying to divest ourselves from that and trading with other East Asian countries, trading with India more, trading with Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines. I'm perfectly fine with that. If they produce goods way cheaper than we could ever produce them, there's no point in us not buying it from them. But the problem here is Doug Ford is justifying basically blaming China for his own bad domestic policy. Does China dump a lot of cheap goods into Canada that's probably just trying to get artificial control over a market? Yeah, somewhat. I don't want to trade with them more for national security reasons, not because they're cheating us. They're not really cheating us. In fact, products in some cases can be produced cheaper in, again, places like Vietnam. The problem right now in Ontario is taxes are too high. That there's no reason to really produce anything in Ontario other than our dollar is so cheap that Americans will sometimes get part of a car to be built in Ontario, like the chassis get built in Ontario and then they get finished in Detroit. That happens, but it's the domestic taxes. But now this is Ford's new line.
China is playing by its own rules, is flooding markets, hijacking supply chains, undercutting our workers, and threatening our industries. I'll tell you right now, Ontario isn't going to sit back and let it happen. We will always stand up for our workers. We will do whatever it takes to protect Ontario, their families, the workers, the businesses, and communities.
Is he going to cut taxes? This is like Justin Trudeau exactly saying, we're going to do whatever it takes to fight back against the Americans, dollar for dollar tariffs, all this stuff. And he's like, how about you cut taxes? No. And even Ford, again, he wants to do some sort of retaliatory measures against the U.S. because Trump is instituting these tariffs, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum products, not just from Canada, but from everywhere outside of the U.S. Do you know what we should do in this case? Cut taxes to that entire industry, an industry specific tax cut of like 35%, 40%, I would say 50%. Slash taxes to that industry so that our products can be lowered in price so that Americans can keep buying it anyways.
If Canada and the US want to win, if we want to protect our workers and their paychecks, we need to fight together, not each other.
He's so tiring. The real reason that Doug Ford wants this election is twofold. One, the Ford PCs hate the federal conservatives because the federal conservatives, outside of when O'Toole was the leader, are actually conservative. And Doug Ford resents that. He already resents being compared to his brother Rob Ford, who was a real conservative, probably the best conservative politician that Ontario has ever had, even if he was just the mayor of Toronto. That guy was a fiscal hawk. He is kind of like Elon Musk and his Doge team, where it doesn't matter how small the wasteful spending is, he would cut it. Because if he cuts thousands of little instances of $50,000 here, $100,000 here, a couple million there, he was able to actually reduce the taxes and fees to Toronto taxpayers. He was very good. And now with Pierre Poilievre likely to become the Prime Minister of Canada, yes, the Liberals are surging. I think it's more of a red mirage than anything. But if the federal Conservatives win and Pierre Poilievre becomes the Prime Minister, Doug Ford looks like a complete hack in contrast because people naturally compare people to the best. And right now in Canada, you really can't compare Doug Ford to anyone. Yeah, I guess you could compare him to Blaine Higgs, but he's gone. You could compare him to Danielle Smith, but those are completely different worlds between Ontario and Alberta. And so, yeah, I guess Scott Moe, but again, it's kind of hazy. It's a less well-known comparison to make between smaller Western provinces and the juggernaut of Ontario. But if Poilievre becomes prime minister and he starts cutting taxes and regulations and enforcing parental rights policies, which would actually require him to go after Ford for being a complete hack and not actually protecting Ontario children and parents himself, Doug Ford doesn't want them to win. That's why he's having this stupid early election. One, he wants to get his next term in before standards go up. And then two, he also wants to make it so that the next election is delayed and it sucks momentum away from the federal conservatives. Because by having the election now, Jagmeet Singh and Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau have the perfect reason not to have an early election. Oh, there's Ontario voter fatigue right now. Oh, well, there's a trade war going on. There was just an election in Ontario. We need a couple of months to stabilize the country, and then we can have an election. Jagmeet Singh is already hedging, and the Ontario election is perfect fodder for him to hedge more on. This is Doug Ford simply trying to disrupt things. It was pretty famous in 2019 that because of certain scandals in his government and Andrew Scheer didn't really want to go on the campaign trail with Doug Ford, that Doug Ford resents the Conservatives heavily and doesn't actually like them at all. That is why he keeps partnering with the federal Conservatives. He called Chrystia Freeland called Doug Ford her therapist, and he called her one of his best friends. Well, her one of his it's ridiculous. He praises Justin Trudeau on the economy and during COVID, and he was the lockdown king of the country. The only person worse than Doug Ford was probably Francois Legault in Quebec, but that's barely even part of Canada. That clip is going to come back to bite me one day, but I like making fun of Quebec every once in a while. I like you guys somewhat. Don't worry about it. But yeah, Doug Ford is simply disrupting things for his own political gain and to the detriment of the federal conservatives because, in fact, he actually likes the federal liberals around because his entire political career is based on just dumping taxpayer dollars into favored industries and favored regions to buy votes. Ford is basically a liberal and a retail politician turned into the worst sort of person. All he does is use his taxpayer money to win elections. He takes money and just gives people $200 checks right before the election. Isn't that a little bit sketchy? Feels like a bribe to me. In fact, Bonnie Crombie, who is not conservative, I'm not arguing that, she on certain issues is to the right of Doug Ford. I'm not saying she's even center right, But Doug Ford is so left on certain issues. Bonnie Crombie is, in fact, to his right. She criticizes some of the subsidies he makes as being obvious handouts to friends. She criticizes him for putting a box around John A. Macdonald's statue on Queen's Park and calls it unpatriotic. She's right. I don't like Bonnie Crombie, but that's just correct. It's ridiculous. She's even been calling out his drug practices because he's done nothing to shut down the injection sites, and he's been, in fact, allowing more to be approved. She's actually called out his failed policies on crime, basically just blaming things on the federal government when he, with the OPP, actually does have enforcement powers, and he's been sluggish on actually like addressing the issue of crime. Violent crime is like up 35% in Ontario since he took over. It's crazy. Anyways, that should be it for me today, guys. Again, reminder, please vote for the New Blue Party of Ontario. They might not have a candidate in your riding, in which case vote for basically any independent that's on the ballot. But if there is a New Blue Party of Ontario candidate, it doesn't matter if they can't win. Don't get sucked into the Stockholm syndrome argument that if we don't vote PC, the Liberals could win. The PC party has to demonstrate it's different than the Liberals and actually significantly conservative before you actually consider voting for them. New Blue Party is basically the standard. It is like the federal Conservatives. Give them a vote because there is a per vote subsidy that they can win if they do better than 5% in the riding. So getting out and voting actually does have the ability to build up a new alternative party like the Reform Party or the Canadian Alliance or the BC Conservatives in the long run by them being able to get access to those funds. I don't like the per vote subsidy, but the Ontario PCs and the Liberals and the NDP are going to take it. Why shouldn't the smaller party that's actually trying to combat corruption and bring conservatism back to Ontario take it too? Check the website for the New Blue Party, see what ridings still need a candidate. In the last 24 hours here, you could easily get the paperwork, get in contact with the New Blue Party, get your 25 signatures, and be on the ballot. Even if you can't campaign much, you can be there as a dumping ground for people who actually care about conservatism. Anyways, see you guys later.